If someone in a lab coat told you to press a button that would deliver a painful electric shock to a complete stranger, you'd refuse. Obviously, you know right from wrong. You have a conscience. You're not that kind of person. That's what every single participant believed. Going into one of the most infamous experiments in the history of psychology, they were wrong. Almost all of them. In 1961, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram built an experiment so unsettling that it's still debated, still taught, still argued over more than 60 years later. He wasn't trying to find cruel people. He was testing ordinary people, teachers, engineers, postal workers, completely average human beings. And what he discovered wasn't that some people are secretly monsters. It was something far more disturbing, that almost anyone, under the right conditions, will do almost anything if the right person in the right uniform simply tells them to. Today, we're breaking down exactly how that happens. And by the end of this video, you're going to have to ask yourself an uncomfortable question. Would you have pressed the button too? Here's how the experiment actually worked. A participant walks into a lab at Yale University. They're told they're taking part in a study on memory and learning. A man in a white lab coat, the authority figure, explains the setup. There's a teacher, played by the actual participant, and a learner, who's strapped into a chair in the next room, wired to electrodes. The teacher reads word pairs. Every time the learner gets one wrong, the teacher is instructed to deliver an electric shock and increase the voltage each time. The switches on the shock generator are labeled clearly. Slight shock, moderate, strong, very strong, all the way up to a switch simply labeled danger, severe shock, and beyond that, an ominous XXX. Here's the twist. The learner was an actor. There were no real shocks, but the participant didn't know that. As far as they understood, they were causing real pain to a real person. As the voltage climbed, the actor would groan, then yell, then scream to be let out, then go completely silent, which, chillingly, is often more disturbing than the screaming and the man in the lab coat standing right there. He didn't threaten. He didn't yell. He simply said 4 calm phrases over and over. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. Milgram predicted almost nobody would go all the way to the maximum shock. He was catastrophically wrong. 65% of participants went all the way to the maximum lethal labeled voltage. Not because they were cruel. Many of them were visibly distressed, sweating, stuttering, laughing nervously, begging the experimenter to stop the study, but they kept pressing the button anyway. Think about that number for a second. 65%. That's not a small, disturbed minority. That's almost 2 out of every 3 ordinary people in a controlled setting, willing to inflict what they believed was severe and potentially lethal harm on another human being, simply because someone in a position of authority told them it was necessary. So what was actually happening inside their heads? Here's the part of this experiment that changes how you see obedience forever. Because Milgram didn't just document that people obeyed. He identified the exact psychological mechanism that made it possible, a mental switch that flips inside almost anyone under the right pressure. And once you understand that switch, you'll start noticing it everywhere, in workplaces, in militaries, in your own life, before we get into that. If this kind of deep evidence-based psychology is your thing, hit subscribe, because we break down a study just like this every single week. And if the number 65% just made your stomach drop a little, smash that like button because it's about to get even more unsettling. Let's keep going. Milgram's explanation is called the Agentic State, and it's one of the most important and disturbing ideas in social psychology. Here's the core claim. When a person perceives themselves as acting under the authority of someone else, they undergo a psychological shift. They stop seeing themselves as an autonomous individual responsible for their own choices. They start seeing themselves as an agent, an instrument carrying out someone else's will. Think of it like this. When you're driving your own car, you feel fully responsible for where it goes. But if you're just the mechanic tightening a bolt on someone else's car and they crash it later, you don't feel responsible for the crash. You were just doing your job. You were just following the instructions. That's the agentic shift. The participants in Milgram's study weren't switching off their morality. They were transferring their sense of moral responsibility upward, to the experimenter, to the institution, to Yale University itself. In their minds, they weren't the ones causing harm. They were simply the mechanism through which the authorities' decision was carried out. This connects directly to a concept coined by philosopher Hannah Arendt, the banality of evil. Arendt coined the phrase while covering the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a key architect of the Holocaust. What struck her wasn't that Eichmann was a monster. It was how disturbingly ordinary he seemed. A bureaucrat. A man who described himself as simply following orders, doing his job, moving paperwork through a system. Evil, Arendt argued, doesn't always look like a monster twirling a mustache. Sometimes it looks like an unremarkable person who has simply stopped asking whether what they're doing is right because someone above them has already decided for them. Here's why this experiment refuses to go away. More than 60 years later, every hierarchy carries the seeds of the agentic state. Corporate environments, where employees follow unethical instructions because that's what management wants. Military. Structures where soldiers commit atrocities because they were just following orders, even smaller. Everyday moments, staying silent when a boss says something clearly wrong, because pushing back doesn't feel like your place. The uncomfortable truth Milgram forces us to confront is this. Evil doesn't require evil people. It just requires ordinary people willing to hand their moral agency over to someone else, and a structure convincing enough to make that handoff feel reasonable. The good news? Milgram's later studies found something crucial: the presence of even one dissenting voice, someone else in the room, who refused to continue, dramatically reduced obedience rates. Moral courage, it turns out, is contagious. One person saying no gives everyone else permission to say it too. So here's the question this experiment leaves you with. Not, am I a good person? Almost everyone believes that about themselves, including 65% of the people who press that final button. The real question is, would you recognize the moment your moral responsibility was being quietly handed off to someone else? And would you have the courage to hold on to it anyway? If this made you rethink something about obedience, authority, or your own moral compass, drop a comment and tell me what stood out to you. I read every single one. And if you want more deep dives into the psychology experiments that changed how we understand human nature, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're just getting started. See you in the next one.